We go to the 21st gate. We go to this gate of being in control. In the Black Book, it says the justified and necessary use of power in overcoming deliberate and persistent interference. Now think about the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva goes through its process of checking out all the opinions of others, finally gets to an opinion that it really can live with. It's ready to come down from the mountain, and when it comes down from the mountain, it says, my way or the highway. Because otherwise it doesn't work. And it's interesting to understand that the most powerful logic awareness gate, this 17th gate, that what it leads directly to is the power of controlling the community, and by that instilling the community with that knowledge. One of the things that I have mentioned, but not often enough, is that the responsibility of the 4521, because they are the outlet for the tribe, is to ensure that the tribe is healthy, that the tribe has proper clothing, that the tribe has proper housing, but most of all, that the tribe is properly educated. If you do not educate your children, your tribe ultimately fails and stops being competitive, because it is the nature of humans to grow through education. So education is a major theme in the 4521. It's very important. The ruler in the 45, if they cannot educate their people, they will never have loyalty. And if they cannot educate their people, they will never raise the standard of living of their society. Absolutely essential. So this movement from the 17 to the 21 is a very important movement to understand. These logical opinions, the logic that's so important to our stability, immediately then moves into this tribal application, where the tribal application then controls the education. This is what you have to learn. Children now have to learn how to use computers, blah, 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 whatever it may be. And this is coming only out of this control mechanism that operates out of the ego. 21st gate. Every time I talk about biting through, I remind people that this is just so, that the 21st gate has to be responsible for what it eats, for what it wears, and for where it lives. But after all, there is a difference between having that ego defined or undefined, and there is a difference depending on the type. Those things have to be honored. If you have an undefined ego, then that 21 is something that has to be recognized by the other in the conditioning, and it has to be offered to you as something you can use as a power. The other has to recognize that. If you don't have it connected to the throat, then it's going to be dependent on the various ways it can get to the throat or can get to the sacral. All those things have to be taken into consideration. But the rule still remains. The 21s must have that responsibility, and the most important responsibility of the 21 is to be educated. Because without that education, without their capacity to be able to express clearly their role in being in control, they will be resented and they will be resisted. And this is something that is very common. We experience that in human design. This is the only privately owned esoteric system in the world. It's not privately owned to turn everybody into billionaires. It's privately owned because this is something very, very special. And the way in which it is developed and brought to people, the way the education goes, so that we have basic standards, all of those things exist. And all of a sudden you have an organization and you have rules. I mean, I'm an anarchist. I hate rules. But I also recognize that rules exist. And for me, it's not about right or wrong. It's simply about what's necessary in order to be able to get things done. The tribe, the way in which we organize the material plane, the way in which we educate others is based on rules, is based on conditions. If you can't live with them, that's okay. There are those who can and those who can't. But the 21 begins as an educator. Educated themselves so that they can express the nature of why they're in control, and then educating others so that they are of benefit to others. All of that ends up being that the 21 is a gate that does not want to be bothered, in the sense that it does not want to be challenged. The first line, the willpower and ego to ensure respect. This is the foundation. or the lack of willpower that is forced to ask for respect. It says the use of force is a last resort. Now look, the 21 is there to be respected without having to say, I'm the boss, you do what I say. This is what education is all about. If the 21 is properly educated about the nature of their responsibilities, then it can express those responsibilities to the other without resorting to force. But if the other cannot then accept that, then force is necessary. 21s are not to be messed with. It's just the way it is. And of course, they have to be correct in their own nature. They better be educated. And they better be clear about what their responsibility is to the other. In the first line, you get the core of what the 21 is about. It is about will and ego. That 21 and the ego, when it's defined, can make that promise. I will educate you. I will be of benefit, but you let me control how that works, because that's my job. And let me educate you as to why I have to do that and why it's a benefit to you and to others. The second line. Might is right. It says the legitimacy of action in response to flagrant and persistent interference. Think of the horror of being a 21-2. I mean, what a trip. You're in your own house. You're minding your own business. You're in control of everything. Everything. And you keep on having these people banging on your door. Excuse me, could I sell you this product? Excuse me, this constant rapping at the second door. Nothing can be more surprising than the response of a 21-2 when they've been bothered too often. They will just bloody well explode, scream, ego power, their heart pumping, the acid pouring in their gall system. You surprise them, you call them out. And in the moment you do that, you're asserting control over them and they don't like it. And after all, the 21-2, that can be such an important force for others, somebody's got to be able to go in there, knock on their door and say, okay, but I don't want to control you, I just want to tell you, you could do that. To try to get to them so that they recognize that they're not just alone in the world and there's other things going on. Mars exalted. Great place for Mars to be exalted. Powerful and extreme reaction. Here the severest action will be the most successful. You want to know where the Zen slap comes from? I mean, this is severe, tapping the 21 on the shoulder and telling them that they don't know what they're doing. Oh boy. You can get really surprised. A legitimate rejection of interference on the material plane. Stay out of my business. Rule number 1 for 21s. Don't have a boss. If you have a boss, you're in trouble. Because you will have nothing but struggle, nothing but problems, nothing. It doesn't mean there can't be somebody further up in the hierarchy. That's okay, that's normal. It just means that wherever you are in that hierarchy, you have absolute authority and control, and there is no interference. People recognize that a 21-2 has the power to control others. They would like to take advantage of that. But that doesn't mean that they're ready to control others. It doesn't mean that they can control others. Remember that the second line has to be educated. 21-2s really have to have a good education. And then they can be ready. In the detriment, the Neptune in detriment, a tendency to regret severity no matter how legitimate. This is not the other side of the coin. 21s, ego people, always suffer at the hands of all the other centers. You know, if you had all 9 centers sitting in a room doing therapy together, all 8 of them would be picking on the ego. They really would. They'd just be picking on the ego. It's this little center with these 4 little gates, and all the other centers just gang up and pick on it. So, what to do? This is personal experience. In my experience with the voice, in the Great Course, I told that story. I had a day in which every single one of the centers had a voice, was communicating to me. And the ego was really given a hard time by everybody else. You know, it's a child after all, so it gets treated in a kind of childlike fashion. You know, it's this wonderful essence of what we are. It is our heart after all, and it is our stomach. You know, this old cliche about you are what you eat and all this stuff. I mean, you know, the ego is something that's very, very special. But the fact of the matter is that these ego beings, they must be in control. They can't have other forces dominating them. They cannot. They cannot. And the moment that they do, they have enormous difficulties. And when the ego is in trouble, death isn't far away. The essential ingredients of the ego, these aspects of the ego, the thymus, which is part of our immune process, the heart muscle itself, the stomach itself, the gall system itself, you know, these are areas of enormous vulnerability, and the ego brings a lot of death. It brings a lot of death simply because it's not allowed its power. And this is the first rule for the 21, is to recognize that it inherently is here to control. Not because it's better, not because others are sheep that need to be led. It's simply because that is its role in this life. That is the mechanics of what that gate is. And when you get to the 3rd line, you really get to see the nature of this in powerlessness. I have all kinds of people who have the 21-3. I get to this line, and you know, there's a kind of cloud that comes over their eyeballs. I know I'm powerless. Remember the nature of trial and error. The 21-3. The 21-3 tries to take control, gets smashed. Suffers terribly. 21-3, because it's its nature to be in control, tries to take control again, gets smashed. And every time it's trying to take control, it's in a situation where it is beneath somebody else in a hierarchy. It has a boss. It has a partner that acts as the boss. It has a friend that acts as a boss. It has a dog that acts as the boss. It's infuriating for the 21-3. The 21-3 desperately tries to then take control in those situations, only to get smashed. The dog bites it, it gets fired. The secret for the 21-3 is don't deal with superior forces. And of course, the whole business is that they have to learn that. Right? Again, this is an introduction line. Where the just are condemned to a futile confrontation with superior forces. Defeat as a survivable humiliation, often acceptable through the abuse of drugs and alcohol. What a nice line, eh? And the Jupiter in detriment, total withdrawal. The moment that a 21 is powerless, that's its health condition. The moment a 21 is powerless, it gets sick. It's just the essence of what it is. The moment it's powerless, it gets sick. Unless one follows one's own material path, the breaking of the ego by superiors. You know, you have to do your thing. It does not mean you cannot work for others. All 21s have to recognize that. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that powerlessness is something that can be avoided. It cannot. These people must go through that powerlessness in order to recognize what that is all about, to be of value to others in that. But again, it is a maturing process. And as a maturing process, there is the potential not to get into those situations, not to allow yourself into situations where you have to be controlled by others, only then to have to struggle with them. So important for 21s. Remember something about the nature of gates. Each gate, there's only 64, each gate, as it functions within the totality, has enormous importance for us. Enormous importance. All of these 21 gates put together is the way in which all of our communities are guided and function. It's an essential ingredient, whether we're going to be educated, whether we're going to be properly looked after. So 21s, all based on their definition and their type and what their authority is, all of those 21s have to be in positions where they're allowed to live out their natural authority, their natural capacity to be in control for the benefit of others. Now remember, the third line, it's not its fault, it's trial and error. What the third line recognizes and gets to learn is who has power and who doesn't. It's very good at that. And how people can get access to power or not. The 21 in the first lines, in the lower trigram and at the beginning of the fourth line, this is the right angle cross of tension. The tension cross is 21, 48, 38, 39. This is the cross of tension. These people generate enormous tension. And it is that tension that holds everything together. You know, it's like the strings of my guitar. If you eliminate the tension, there is no music. It doesn't exist. And the more tension you apply, the clearer the tones and the notes that are revealed. These are people that bring tension into society, that they wire us up, that they hook us up, that they create the pressure of interdependency in order that the community can be productive. When you get to the fourth line of strategy, this is this transpersonal capacity. It says careful appraisal of opposing forces to establish a proper response. Again, a learning process, and think about how familiar that is as a fourth line already. Remember what the 17.4 was all about. The 17.4 was also about understanding the motivation of those who want to be led and who want to be your student and want to be your follower. And here you have the same fourth line activity. Remember, all lines through genetic continuity carry the same structural themes. Careful appraisal of opposing forces to establish a proper response. Success in action through clarity. That clarity is about the 21 understanding the other. Remember that the 21 has to be able to educate the other, both as to why it's in control and why the other needs that kind of direction in its process. So this appraisal of opposing forces is very important, to understand them in order to be able to guide them. However, by understanding them, it does not mean that the 4 changes its straight line. All it does is try to find a way to get its straight line across. In other words, the manipulation of it, the shape of it, the style of it, in order to get that information across to the other side. The earth and detriment, a tendency when in the right to misjudge the power of one's opponents. Very important. If you're clear as a 21 and you can externalize, then you're going to be successful in taking control. That's the first thing. That's the exalted. As it says in the White Book, the ego to succeed on the material plane and the instinct to use willpower effectively in response to conditions. So this can be very, very successful. Remember, all fourth lines carry with them this quality of influence. So the 21.4 can have enormous influence in the way that it guides. But remember, the tribe can be guided down a blind track. It can be guided into war that is destructive. It can be guided into transformations within the community that turn out to be non-productive. Simply because the person that's guiding them has this externalizing influence over them. 21-4s can be very powerful forces. When you're looking at the detriment, this is the missionary that is so convinced of being right that it steps on a lot of toes, ends up in a lot of problems, and has difficulty in controlling or influencing others. The drive when in the right to follow one's ego rather than one's instincts. Because remember, the 21 is always looking at the other because they care. That's where they start. I mean, taking control is a real burden. I mean, if you don't have a 21, you can end up resenting them and not liking them. But understand how much of a burden it is to be a 21, to carry the responsibility of being in control, and to carry that responsibility of getting other people to accept that control when everybody's running around saying, yes, no, I don't like this, I don't like that, whatever the case may be. So it's an ordeal to begin with. When you get to the transpersonal lines, it does get easier because the social skills are there until you finally get to the 5th line. The juxtaposition, the end of the 4th line, is called a cross of control. And this is the most fixed controlling agents. These are people that will have their personality sun in the 21, and they will have their design sun in the 54, in the 1st line. So there'll be 4 ones. People have the 21-4, the 4th line personality, the 1st line design. These will be people who have the juxtaposition cross, a fixed cross of control. And you can see that in that, these are the deepest controlling agents. By the way, they can give the 21s a bad reputation. I mean, they are what people call control freaks. They are so fixed on being in control that they often generate a lot of waves and end up not being influential at all. Having impact, but not being influential. 4th lines can always have enormous impact because of their capacity to be opportunistic. To take that right opportunity and to be able to jump into that. When you get to the left angle cross, you see the transpersonal maturity of the 21 as a controlling agent. Because when you get to the 21-5 and the 21-6, you have the cross of endeavor. That is, these are forces that can really do things. And they can really get things done, not by themselves, but by their capacity to be able to educate those that they are in control of and responsible for, to educate them so that they can work together, and in working together be able to create abundance for their tribe. So these are tribal leaders that bring endeavor into the life of the tribe. The 5th line, it's called objectivity. And it says the use of force must be based on impartiality and not emotionally motivated. Again, an introduction line, a lifetime process. It says the principled and legal character that ensures objectivity. In the White Book, that line is the balanced egos whose willpower is applied objectively. 21-5s are rarely in control of anything for a long time. Remember that 5th lines operate at their best in times of crisis. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be a world crisis and it has to be cosmic and all this stuff. Crisis is at any level. But that's when the 5th line is called for. It's when it's called on. So it's one of those things to understand about the 21-5 is that in the language of business, the 21-5 is a troubleshooter. You got your business, you think it's great, you've been running it for 10 years, it starts going into the toilet, you don't know what to do, you bring in a 21-5. And everybody projects that the 21-5 is going to be able to save the company. Doesn't mean the 21-5 can or will, but they are equipped. And if the 21-5 can live up to that projection, they will be considered a great hero, and the next time that they go to save another company, they can charge 10 times as much. That's the progression of all that. But think of the 21.5 for what it is. Practical needs in revolutionary times. The business is in trouble, the tribe is in trouble. That's the opportunity to bring in this kind of controlling force that stays in control for a while, whatever it is, whatever it takes to bring the organization back into structure, and then they're expected to give up power. Only the 21.5 is really ready at any time in its life to give up power, voluntarily. The 21.4 can be ripped from power. You can see this in the 7.4, the line of the abdicator. That when the will of majority is totally against it, that it will be dragged from its throne. The 21.4 can be torn from its power. But the 21.5 has the capacity to give up the power. By the way, it knows something wonderful. That when you give up the power, you have twice as much power as you had when you had the power. And you're twice as attractive to those who are in trouble. It's a nice game. Remember, fifth lines are all about seduction, right? The Pluto in detriment. It says the drive for elimination is so powerful that objectivity is related purely to cause and not effect. That is, the ego whose willpower is applied subjectively. That's okay. It's just different. You have these two troubleshooters. You got the objective troubleshooter and you got the subjective troubleshooter. It doesn't mean that the subjective one is going to be less successful. It's just going to be different. When it comes in to help out the company, it brings in its cronies. It says, well, my friend Jack can do this job in the meantime. It simply is a subjective way rather than an objective way, but there is no inherent difference. It's the same thing and it's the same rule. In other words, you have to be called in times of crisis, and in that time of crisis you have your power to take control, and when you've achieved your goal, you quit. And of course that brings you more power, and on and on and on and on and on. You never, in that sense, lose the power as a 21.5. When you get to the 6th line, if you have a child that's a 21.6, I hope you're unemotional. They will try to take control of everything and anything, because control is what their life is all about. To see clearly what control is, what is the correct education, what is the way in which the tribe can be improved, all of that stuff that's inherent in the 21. The line is called chaos. And it says, where ineffective action leads to disorder. In the white book with the Pluto, because it's easier to see it first, where the ego is out of touch, the display of willpower leads to disorder. The ego is only out of touch when it is not taking into consideration the impact of control on others. And everything about the transpersonal gates is about recognizing that control is something that is always going to be difficult for the other unless they are properly educated and it is clear why the control is necessary. The 6th line in the beginning of its process, like all 6 lines, has to get burnt. So it controls for the sake of control and tries controlling everything. And of course it leads to all kinds of inappropriate action, which gets censured and punished, as ego always does. These are wonderful people. I mean, as long as you're not their parents, and they're wonderful people, because by the time they've gone through all of that chaos, they're the only ones who know what chaos really is. And because they know what chaos really is, they know how to avoid it and ultimately become great teachers in the way of all 6 lines. You know, the 21.5, the factory's in trouble. The 21.5 has been hired, brought in as the new dictator in order to save the company. And it's the 21.6 that's asked whether it thinks that that 5 can actually do the job because it knows whether it will bring chaos or not. And they're of enormous value to the tribe. It's what you would call in the old days, well, not in the old days, backroom politician. You know, the one who's never really in front, but the one that everybody has to go to make sure that the deal will really work, and the one to go to get the advice to find out whether the deal is really of value. It comes from the 21.6, but remember, wherever you see an introduction to a line, you know it's a long process. Don't get confused in that. You may get the chaos instead of the wisdom. In the Black Book, the Exalted, the war of attrition, the continuance of legitimate action in the hope of eventually succeeding despite all odds and increasing disorder. This is the early stage, control for control's sake, no matter what. And what that leads to. Remember, in reading somebody's line, it is never about changing the line. It's always about accepting the process. And what you will find is that the difficult nature of a line is almost always associated with lines that have an introduction. In other words, what it's saying is, this is a process that you have to move through, and you're going to go through all of this chaos until you finally get to that point that's there for you. When you discover that ineffective action leads to disorder. Not simply for yourself, but for others. You know, why control somebody's costume that they wear if it doesn't affect productivity? In other words, to learn all of these various things about what control leads to chaos, what control leads to productivity, this is the long-term process that's here in this 6th line. The Venus in detriment. Withdrawal and reliance on inner order in a chaotic situation. What happens to a lot of 21.6s is that they experiment with control when they're young. And because it blows up in their face, because it's supposed to, because that's how they learn, that's their learning arc, then they go up onto the hill and only control their own lives. You know, they are always the reluctant controllers. Yes, I could control that, but I don't want to. I'd rather avoid it. I'd rather stay away from it. And why should I teach those people? Because if I teach them, I have to control them, and I don't want to control them, so why bother? I'm going to sit up here on the hill and stay away from all the chaos, because I know that chaos comes from trying to control. Until finally that 6th line can meet control that's legitimate. Please understand, control is not legitimate unless it brings the valued education that eliminates resistance to control. This is the whole thing. In other words, control is something that has to be acceptable to the controlled. And it can only be acceptable through education. If they are educated properly and they still don't want to be controlled, get rid of them. Fire them. Shoot them. Put them aside somewhere in a pasture. But at least that is clear for the 21. So the business here within this 21st gate, when you see this in somebody's design, is for them to understand the importance of being in control, to honor the way they get there through whatever their definition and type is, but for you to remember that the whole process of being in control is the direct result of learning and teaching that we found in the 17. That it's the Bodhisattva's next move is to bring the teaching and the correct opinions to the totality, through the tribe, through control, through being able to establish the proper facilities and the proper process by which the tribe can be educated. And that's the first rule of all 21s, that control must serve. It must serve. And it can only serve if it is clear. That is, if the controller is educated and the controlled are educated as to why it exists. Nothing worse than blind control. That's dictatorship. Most of us refuse to be controlled in a dictatorial way. And that you will see in the world that dictatorships can only exist successfully where there is great ignorance in the world, where there is great poverty and ongoing crisis, so the dictators are constantly given the power of control. The more educated we become, the more that control is something that is legitimate for us, because this is what's provided us with the basis of our modern civilization. Schools, teaching programs, all of these things that come out naturally out of the 21.